All right, everybody, welcome. Thank you. We will start on time. Thank you all for coming and braving the rainy weather. I'm Tim Carney. I'm a senior fellow here at American Enterprise Institute, and I was privileged to be asked by Naomi and Sally to moderate this, which it's a topic that touches on some of my research, but really in this book, Mine and the Children, they collected a bunch of great essays on, frankly, a lot of topics that I was talking to Naomi right before lunch. If one person was asked, okay, can you explain why we have a crisis of mental health among children and adolescents, that would be way too overwhelming. So they did a great job of bringing together all of these essays. So we're just going to have a discussion here. We're going to rope you guys in pretty soon. There's no long lectures or PowerPoints or anything, but I do encourage everybody to take home a copy of this book and to read the essays. So starting immediately to my right, Naomi Schaefer Riley she's a senior fellow here at AEI. She's the author of a lot of books. I tried to count both of Naomi and Sally's books and couldn't, but at least two of them are on children, and again, she's one of the editors of this volume. Dr. Sally Satel is a psychiatrist, a lecturer at Yale School of Medicine. I think that's still true, right? Yes, and she's a senior fellow here at AEI and also the author of many books. They wrote the introduction and the conclusion, and they helped collect these essays. And so I'm just going to start with sort of the question in the beginning of the book, sort of how are the kids doing and what's the matter? Sally?
Well, I didn't make slides, but I think people have heard that they're not doing that well. So I'm just going to do the slightest overview because I think people know some of these statistics that are pretty worrisome. Anyway, apparently one in five kids, and I'm saying kids, I mean teens, about 12 to 18, 19-year-olds are diagnosed with a mental health condition. So we're not talking typically about severe mental illnesses like psychotic illnesses, schizophrenia, bipolar, but depression, anxiety, maybe ADHD, things like that. That's 20%, that's a lot. And you can quibble whether, we have a lower threshold for diagnosing these days or some criterion for making diagnoses have changed. But when we look at other things, for example, like self-reports, the CDC, for example, has collected data showing that 40% of all teens claim to be persistently sad and hopeless. Now, maybe they have a different gauge for expressing it that way, but that's still a sizable percentage. Girls especially seem beleaguered. 60% said they were persistently hopeless. Suicidal ideation has gone up from 2007 to 2021 from 14% to 22%. So again, more than 1 in 5 entertain suicide. And attempts have gone up during that time, almost doubled, to where 9% of all teens have actually made some attempt, according to these data. Depression has increased, or depressive symptoms. Now, as a psychiatrist, I know that symptoms doesn't always signal a clinical syndrome, but still, it's not healthy to be depressed this much. And according to this slide, this graph from Monitoring the Future, which is a survey done out of NIH, 16% in 1991 expressed depressive symptoms, and that has almost doubled to 30 to 34% as of 2022. And then I'll just finish up by mentioning that it goes beyond sort of self-report of mood status into actual hospitalizations. I mean, this is really kind of where the rubber meets the road, is how are people behaving in a way versus how are they claim they're feeling. The latter is important too, but to me, it's always more compelling when you have hard data about how people act. So between hospitalizations for intentional self-harm, which is usually a suicidal intent, not always, but went up, 91% in girls, a little, and it went up about 50% in boys between 2007 and 2019. So that's pretty impressive. Even though the absolute numbers are still low, it's still, the relative changes are impressive. And then finally, this is the last data, that suicide rates have also gone up for 15 to 19-year-olds. Again, thank goodness they're still low, and they're lower than the adult average population. But from 2001, they were about 8 per 100,000, and actually seemed to peak in 2017 at 12. But that's significant. The average suicide rate now is 14 per 100,000, but much higher in men, 22. So this is kind of the backdrop. So what's contributing to this is the question, and that's of course what the book is about. I just want to reassure people that these data are they come from a lot of sources. They're not just from one database. There's CDC and NIH and SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. Those are all national, but there are private foundations. There's the Macy Foundation and Pew, and they all tend to converge on these general patterns. So again, it's not just, there's a lot of parallel data. So I'll just close up by saying when Naomi gets the credit for this book because she asked me to participate. And actually what I found kind of compelling is it's really the same, in some ways it was the same dynamic that I kind of think about every day because I have another job in a methadone clinic, so I'm concerned a lot with people who use drugs. And in my experience, it's never a drug. A drug is never enough. It's what is the template, the human template that the drug is acting on that makes that drug so compelling that a person becomes addicted to it. But that's my general perception about many things. It's never the exposure alone. It's the exposure coupled with someone or some group that is particularly vulnerable to it. So the parallel here is when we're talking, instead of talking about drugs, and I'm not making an addiction analogy here, but I am talking about social media because that's considered one of a big accelerant for what's going on, or even a cause in some people's telling of it. But I don't think it's a cause. I think it is a dynamic that landed in a population of young people that were almost primed to react in a significant way, a significantly negative way. And then, of course, their involvement with social media exacerbated the original vulnerabilities, which Naomi was going to talk about.
So I think that probably the first question that anyone should ask when they read something like the youth mental health collapse is, there are a lot of people we're talking about, over 70 million kids in America. Who exactly are we talking about, and how are we kind of going to diagnose those kids? And so in my work, I've kind of come to think of American youth population as divided between the overparented and the underparented. So a lot of my time I actually spend thinking about the underparented. These are kids who are involved in the child welfare system. They're often kids whose parents have substance abuse problems. They're kids who are being left alone for long periods of time. They're in schools that are probably not particularly concerned with educational outcomes. They often have to grow up very quickly because they are responsible for a lot of the things that have to go on in their home. They may worry about strangers coming into their home, that their mother's going to bring in a boyfriend. They may not know whether there's going to be food on the table or not, depending on whether the adult who's supposed to be taking care of them has a job. And so those are kids who I think are particularly vulnerable to some of the things that we talk about in this book, whether it's drug use. We have a chapter in the book on cannabis use, for instance, among young people. They're going to be vulnerable also to a lot of the digital media, a lot of social media stuff. One thing I think people probably maybe people have finally caught on to is that the digital divide in this country is actually that less advantaged kids tends to use screens a lot more than more advantaged kids because their parents are not monitoring it as much. So those are kind of the underparented kids, and I think that they are suffering from this mental health crisis in a particular way. And then, we all kind of talk regularly about the overparented kids, the kids who are experiencing helicopter parenting, whose lives are being micromanaged, who are put on this, college path by the time they're 2, who are experiencing all sorts of anxiety around school and performance, and who are overscheduled, and who don't have enough freedom or independence. And so I think, when you look at these two groups side by side, I think what you kind of conclude is sort of what the basics of parenting probably should be. It's some combination of, having structure, of having adults, be aware on a, developmentally appropriate level of, what you're doing, of what you should be doing, making sure that you're not running the streets at night, making sure that you're going to school, that maybe you're going to bed at some kind of reasonable hour, that you're doing some semblance of homework, that you haven't gone down some rabbit hole on your screen that you're never going to come out of. But also that you have some amount of independence to explore, to be able to go outside and play, to be able to form relationships with peers. And I think, we now kind of have these two extremes in this country, and both of those are having, really terrible impacts, I think, on kids' lives. They're both lacking the structures in some ways. Kay Heimwitz, who's here, has a chapter where she talks about how kids are lacking scripts. They don't, maybe 40 years ago or 50 years ago, not everybody, got married and had kids and had a career. But, there was a basic sense, I am a girl or I am a boy, and I know that for sure. And I'm this part of this family. I have these two parents mostly. It's clear to me what my parents do every day, and they're there for me, and they're going to raise me and my siblings, and I have this relationship with my siblings. And those basic scripts, once we kind of took them away, those also created a lot of the problems. So I think what we're seeing with these two groups of kids is, in some ways, an abundance of choice. Every option in the world is kind of open to you on the broadest sense, and also a sense that they're not getting enough of the structure that they need to grow up, thinking positive things about the future. And that's another theme that we definitely talk about in the book. There's a chapter by Robert Pondisio just about the messages that we're sending to kids, about how hopeful they should be about the future. And that's definitely contributing to things too. So that's kind of some of my initial thoughts.
I'm glad that you pointed out sort of the bifurcated problem, the underparenting and overparenting, because I see a lot of confusion in a lot of the popular discussion of this. One is the word parentification. And to give an example of two different uses of this, one woman I know grew up, her dad was basically, he was a non-functioning alcoholic, and so she had to make sure he got out the door in time. She was taking care of her younger siblings from the time they were born. She had these parental obligations at a very young age in a way that harmed her. It got used in the New York Times recently to describe high school and middle school kids who have to babysit their younger kids, their siblings, without consenting to it, have to do their own chores, have to do anything besides hyperachieve at high school. They're being parentified. And so using the analysis of the problems of the neglected to then say that, well, this is a problem among the sort of overprogrammed elites, I think is part of the problem. So I appreciate that distinction. But I want to go, Sally started with sort of some comparisons over time. I think you could point to a couple moments that could be triggers for some of these problems. It was the summer of 2007, the iPhone came out. Summer of 2020, of course, in the spring, everybody was locked down, their schools closed, their basketball games canceled. The hoops were even taken off of the outdoor basketball courts. Do either of those things in your mind, and you might disagree, and some of your authors might disagree, were they meaningful triggers of the problems in here, or did they just reveal it, or what are your thoughts?
Oh, well, I think things started decades before that. And again, we're going to allude to, we have a few authors in the here, so I'm going to allude to their chapters. And during Q&A, if you ask a question that is really relevant to their chapter, we're going to ask them to answer it. But I mean, you could argue that the seeds of this were kind of planted in us in the 60s in terms of a sense of liberation. You know, parents that get divorced, if you're not happy, get divorced, and to actualize yourself. And the primacy of emotions became more prominent. So, but from there on, it was kind of, especially in terms of family intact, the integrity of the family, that slowly started to erode over all these years. Right now, it evolved in a kind of, well, it certainly morphed into a therapeutic culture where I think we medicalize normal distress, which is not to say that ADHD is a real thing. It's on a spectrum like almost everything else. And at the severe end, medications can make an enormous difference. But even in those cases, medication, you know, sort of rarely be by itself. It should be in the context of a family therapy. But other kinds of trends, like being so afraid of, well, the self-esteem movement came up there where everyone got a trophy, and now we're so presume that kids are so fragile and parents are so overprotective. And if you assume kids are fragile and you treat them like they are, they will respond and be fragile. Again, the fatherhood crisis going on and on. The messages of doom, I think that's become a more, I think that emerged within the last 10 years or so. Climate change is apparently, I mean, that's a good example. So if so many kids, I don't know if Carolyn Gorman is in the audience, but she just wrote an article. She doesn't have a chapter, but she just wrote a piece on climate change in schools. And in some schools anyway, it almost seems like kids are being terrorized. And it's a posture of, you know, threat and loss. Nothing seems to be turned into a challenge or something that's interesting. I mean, you could teach a whole class on earth science out of the climate situation and talk about all these fascinating new strategies that, you know, even a young, I don't mean 6-year-olds, but, you know, older kids still in high school could understand about, you know, carbon dioxide, you know, carbon sequestration. And I mean, these are, and there's all kinds of cool things about using iron to do that in the oceans. I mean, you could make it such exciting. You could even get maybe, you know, breed a few geologists out of the whole,
but they don't want
project.
geologists.
But
they want
don't
activists.
do that.
They want to breed activists.
They want to breed activists and they want to breed pessimists and people who feel helpless.
And I think the two moments you pointed to, Tim, are like the moments where kids were especially vulnerable to that. So it's much easier to breed activists with iPhones than it is to breed geologists, probably. But it is.
You need the rare earths. You can't have the iPhones. So.
But I think that there was this kind of vulnerability created by all these other losses in these children's lives that was being filled by the phones, by social media, and then during the lockdown, it just sort of was the perfect storm of that. I mean, other people have pointed this out, but then you had the complete loss of family, of community, of face-to-face interaction, and then that void was completely filled by screens and technology. Even the little that was left, like whether that was your school community or your extended, you couldn't see your grandparents anymore or friends or anything like that.
Well, I like Sally going back to the 1960s, blaming. I mean, we got drugs in here. We got the sexual revolution in here.
Drugs, sex, no rock and roll though.
No rock and roll, and nobody even listens to rock and roll anymore. So it's not a root cause. But so, and the term scripts, life script that Kay uses, again, if you read the op-ed pages of the Atlantic, the Times, the Washington Post, you'll see how it's celebrated that our scripts are being not just rewritten, but like replaced with blank pages. And the liberation, and one of the arguments they will make is that there was repression, and that was a major problem. And you can read today online, like transgender influencers saying what happened to me as a child was child abuse because they tried to make me be a boy when really I wasn't. Or they tried to say you have to get married and have kids, or you're not gay. And so to what extent was the liberation, is there a place where it went wrong? Did we get too much of it? Was it all bad?
Well, I think one concept is that, you can throw away a script, just like, in jazz, you can throw away the thing, you can improvise brilliantly, but you have to build on a structure that is solid. And I think that was the confusion. That we didn't need that firm foundation for kids of knowing how to solve their own problems, of how to delay gratification and control impulses and soothe themselves. All these things, all these developmental tasks are incredibly important. And once they're in place and kids are in a community of other supportive people, then yeah, throw away the damn script, but not too soon.
But I also think that, you have to think about what's good for sort of the most amount of people. And I think if you have kids, most kids need the script. There are going to be a few kids out there who are like, I'm just going to make this up and I'm going to live my own life and I'm going to have these adventures and it's all going to turn out fine. And I think that's a very small number of kids. And honestly, I think those are among the most vocal, activists on the part of on the side of the liberation today, and they don't realize all of the kids who are lost as a result of that kind of idea that's taken hold.
But again, so we're not just talking about you are a boy and you're going to act like a boy. As somebody who went to New York State public schools in the 90s, the what are you going to do when you grow up question that Kay refers to, like nobody ever thought to say, are you going to get married and have kids? Do you want to be a dad? That would have been like a weird thing to ask in a public school. But is that an important part of the script you're thinking about how to be an adult following, marriage and family formation? And again, not that everybody's going to do it, but kind of that's a norm. Does that matter to child mental health, the idea that the future holds marriage and family formation?
Well, you didn't need to have that conversation because the examples were all around you. The teacher didn't need to take you aside and say, like, are you going to get married and have kids when you grow up? Because you were largely surrounded by people who got married and had kids. Now I think, as you get that example less and less around you, yeah, maybe you do need somebody to say that out loud. But yeah, the script is not just an explicit script. It's what you see everywhere.
Can I follow up on that? One of the most horrifying statistics in the book, I think, is in Kay's chapter. It's a Pew study, recent Pew study, that found that only 22% of parents cared or really invested in the idea that their kids got married and had kids. So not only are we raising kids for kids' sake, we're raising them to be parents, essentially. And then 40% of a sample aged, I think it was 19 to 50 or something, said they had no interest in having kids. I don't know why they went up to 50, but maybe they were thinking of, assisted reproduction kinds of things. Yeah. But in any case, that's pretty high.
So, and we referred earlier, I want to talk more about the pessimism about the future. And I sometimes chalk the low and falling birth rates and marriage rates up to a pessimism about the future. But here we talk more about this in two different chapters, really affecting the kids' mental health when they are adolescents. How sure are we that that's actually a cause?
I think I think Robert Pondicio's chapter does a very good job of really tying the mental states of these kids to the messages that they're getting, but also when you ask them particular questions about how they think about the future, their openness to different ideas, whether they view the world as a dangerous place. Mm-hmm. That's that is a very big one right now, and it's one that is I think the overparented kids are definitely getting all the time. There is danger lurking behind every corner. You can't trust other people. We're going to try to sort of build a thick skin for you so that you can be protected when you go out there in the world. It makes you less open to talking to other people, which we know, improves mental health. It makes you less open to new kinds of experiences. I was telling you earlier today. So one of the things that really, made this point come home to me, when my youngest daughter was in 3rd grade, so probably about 4 or 5 years ago, she had to watch a climate change video, but it explained that the world was going to end in 2030. And, maybe that seems like a long time if you're in 3rd grade, but she came home and she was like, that's not that far off.
It's a math lesson.
Yeah, exactly.
Got to integrate it all.
But I think if we start as adults really thinking about the messages that we're giving these kids, we don't take them seriously. I mean, it's a little bit like the people flying around in their private jets, but explaining that the coastline is going to disappear tomorrow. I think we need to actually think about the messages in a very literal way. What are you telling an 8-year-old? And how are they going to integrate that into their worldview? Because they will. So I do think that it makes sense there that this is affecting their mental health.
One quick story on that: when I was a kid, in the New York Times, there was an op-ed called "Is Overpopulation a Tale Too Grim to Tell?" And the argument was that we need to teach kids, school kids, that every problem in the world is caused by the fact that there's too many babies. The illustration was this: the world was like a head of cabbage or lettuce, and bunny rabbits were eating it because we were all breeding like rabbits, I guess. The author was a principal of a public school in New Milford, Connecticut, the John Pettibone School. When I visited recently, John Pettibone School had closed down due to low and falling enrollment. It was now a community center with senior yoga, and there was a dog park.
Overrun with rabbits.
Overrun with rabbits. So Principal Burley did succeed in driving this message home.
Yeah.
So we're going to throw it open to questions. We have the ability, in just a bit, we have the ability for people watching online to submit questions. Is that obvious and so you guys submit questions and I'll take some of those. We're obviously going to take some from the audience. But just a last one, because this one is one that I don't hear people talking about too much, but why does marijuana get a chapter?
Because it's really not, as they say, the marijuana that most adults, grew up with. It's much more potent, at least 15%, whereas, when we were young, this was more like 3 or 5%. So even though drug use in kids has actually gone down, which is kind of an interesting paradox, I suppose, but marijuana is just much more dangerous than it used to be in terms of causing. In fact, I know that Dr. Ken Winters is here, so I had a question for him, but it can cause persistent use of high potency cannabis can lead to temporary psychotic episodes, but even more worrisome and not completely established, studies do conflict here, whether it actually not merely accelerates the emergence of schizophrenia in young people who were destined to have it. And those are the ages, 18 to 25, as if you're developing schizophrenia, that's when it will manifest. But whether it causes a schizophrenic-like syndrome, and that is a chronic problem. And so that's pretty scary. Now, my question, maybe we can
I was going to say, you will get the first question after Naomi.
Okay, so I wanted to add two other things. First of all, daily use of marijuana has increased. And when I sort of think back to, the way the kids I knew growing up used drugs, it was in a very social way. It was, you went to a party and that's where everyone used drugs. Now we're seeing an increasing number of teachers reporting that kids are just showing up on a random Wednesday morning having, high during math class. And I just, if you compare it to alcohol, which I think is what people are usually inclined to do, I didn't know many people were showing up drunk to math class who were in my high school. So I think that kids are thinking about it differently. They're also thinking about it as a way of self-medicating. Many kids are reporting, I'm using this to treat my anxiety. And I think, these are sort of more, I don't know, in my view, more concerning ways of using drugs. And the last interesting thing is that Girls' drug use is now exceeding boys' drug use in a lot of contexts, and that is a new thing. Boys, are more traditionally sort of risk takers, so you might think that they would be the ones to use it. But if you think of drug use as this sort of attempt to self-medicate, and girls are the ones who are suffering more from mental health problems, then you kind of see the pattern there. And one final thing. Again, this is not just cannabis, but all drugs, is that kids are now more inclined to use drugs alone. Again, kind of a, maybe a sad statement about kind of, maybe you could sort of imagine why one would use it at a party, but sort of sitting at home alone using drugs, aside from obviously the dangers of overdose in other contexts, but just this sort of idea that it's just you and your, vape pen is kind of a sad state of affairs. So anyway, but Sally has other thoughts.
So I don't know where Dr. Winters is.
He's over there.
Oh, okay. Okay, so here's my question to you, and I also want to, I'm really going to put people on the spot. Richard Baum from the Office of National Drug Control Policy. Also, if you want to add anything after Dr. Winters, he has a chapter with a colleague on marijuana. My question was, if you took 100 kids who used marijuana daily, 1 or 2 joints a day, again, high potency, which I think is probably all you can get. But anyway, what's a risk? Is 1 in 100 would have a risk of not having a psychotic, but having a chronic, or having a temporary psychotic reaction and then a chronic one?
Well, I wish it was only 1 in 100. Okay. So the data depends, how long a window you want to look out. But here's, there's some dramatic statistics. One of them is, for those that use cannabis regularly, the odds of them getting addicted to it is between 6 and 30%. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily in the teen years. It could be, or it could be later downstream. That's a big number. So who's at the low end and who's at the high end? Kind of gets at your point. At the high end, the 30% group, most likely would be if you started using when you're a teenager, you used regularly, which is almost daily, and you use the high potency stuff. So that would elevate your risk. Now that's getting a problem with addiction. And then there's the whole issue, which is in the chapter focus, which is to what is your risk for schizophrenia or psychosis? So that's a worrisome issue. The Europeans have studied it more so than the Americans, although we've got some studies longitudinal that are looking at it. I guess downstream we'll know more. But if you look at the European data, which is pretty rigorous, and they get nationalized databases from the whole country. For example, Denmark's looked at it and tracked this for since the 1970s. And their estimate, but it's a caveat, I'll mention the caveat, is that there's 5 to 6 times more schizophrenia in their population because of cannabis. So here's the caveat. You can't do a perfect study, right? There's no way you can randomly assign and then look at how things look in a group of people that are high risk that don't use, and then a group of people that are high risk that do, and then compare the two. It won't be done. So you have to look at, the wide range of data, the clinical data, the neurobiological data, animal models, but THC just looks to be nasty. There's a quote in the book from my psychiatrist friend who had a daughter that fell victim. He says, well, if you just use cannabis lightly, it will probably just bend your brain, he says. He calls it bend your brain. But if you use the heavy stuff regularly, it can break it. And that was his way of saying it can lead some people to, really get in big trouble and have serious mental problems.
But we don't know these. No one's really been able to say what the odds are, unless it's...
I mean, the odds would be, what is your risk factor picture? What's risk factors? It's biology, it's environment, it's personality traits, it's how soon in life you used. So, I could give people a list of 5 or 6 that would all be bad, and that would be, elevating one's risk. But you're right, you can't put a single digit. It's sort of the relative issue. You want to play safe in life, you go this route. Yeah. If you want to take a risky path.
Okay, thank you so much. Did you want to add anything, Rich? Sure. Oh. You don't mind, right? Okay.
Thank you. I just want to make a couple comments. Maybe I'll kick it back to you, Sally. When we look at the annual drug stats that come out every year, we long focused on the very young children, 8th graders, 10th graders, from both NISDA the Monitoring the Future survey. And we always worry that we will see that cohort going up, and then we'll see that wave continue. And it really hasn't happened. As you started, the levels of use reported are low. But then we see cannabis use increasing in the 20s and the 30s. And I wonder what you think about that trend line where just as adults, use seems to be going up significantly, yet not at the young ages.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer. But first off, Ken, do you have an answer? And then I'll speculate. But
I'm glad you brought it up.
oh, good.
States, can you hear me in the back? I'll get back.
This is more athletic than our average AEI panel.
Okay, background to what the answer is. About half of the country has legalized it for adult use, about half hasn't. And then a lot of the states that have legalized it, they've had plenty of years to look at what are the changes in our citizens on drug use. Or national data has been looked at, and you split the sample into the legalized states, non-legalized states. Anyway, I'm bringing that up because, as you've noted, the young adult age group is starting to show a big increase in cannabis use, and even a bigger increase in the legalized states versus the non-legalized. So that's worrisome. And then a lot of the data on the link of cannabis use and having the nasty outcome of psychosis shows that young adults are also a very high risk for that to happen. Canada has been looking at it, for example, and about 40% of those that had a cannabis-induced psychotic event where they went to emergency room because things just got out of hand and they ended up in emergency room. Could have been temporary, right? Could have been one time. Well, 40% of them end up with a diagnosis of schizophrenia or psychotic-related disorder within a 3-year window. So these are probably high-risk individuals, but it's young adults as well as teens, and you can see that that's a risk factor. If you have a terrible incident, you gotta stop because likely some of those had that bad incident and they kept using and then fell victim to a disorder.
All right, questions.
I was just wondering also, unless you have a response.
Yeah,
that-
just my
sorry.
last response is I don't think people are fully grasping what's going on here. So I was in San Diego last year, and I was following around a guy who does some drug prevention stuff, but he sent me an article that was about just San Diego emergency rooms alone. We're seeing 45 cases a day of cannabis-induced some kind of psychotic break. And I just, San Diego is not that big. Like, I just don't think that we're fully grasping, even if it's not, schizophrenia, even if it's not resulting in a violent episode. I just wonder how many parents are thinking about those kind of numbers when they're deciding that, cannabis is pretty harmless. So anyway, go ahead.
All right, we got a question right here in the middle. Mic coming from over your right shoulder.
Hello, my name's Ujjwal Puri, and the question I have is, young men are facing a mental health crisis like none other. Back when I was growing up, as a kid, the heroes and idols we looked up to were like Captain America, Superman, maybe Iron Man as well. These figures who represented the epitome of what it means to be an American, what it means to be a patriot, and how to defend the country. But today, whether it's red pill culture, incel culture, Andrew Tates, and all sorts of crazy nonsense that's being peddled on YouTube, it's completely changing and affecting the minds of a whole generation of young men. What can we do to, combat this misinformation and this huge crisis that the future generation of men in this country are going to face, especially mentally, physically, and whatnot?
In my view, a lot of this goes back to what we were talking about in Kay's chapter of a life script. I mean, they have no idea what they're supposed to be. You guys pipe in when I'm done mansplaining here. But But the word toxic masculinity gets used enough that people think masculinity is toxic. Schools, as Richard Reeves, our former neighbor at Brookings, lays out, K through 12 schools are so built for girls, right? I mean, we sent our kids to a grade school, but in second grade, they were, I think your son's having trouble sitting still. Does he have a diagnosis? Yeah, the diagnosis is he's a 7-year-old boy, but the schools are not built for that. And so all these, the lack of a life script, and then just some changes. Greater economic equality between the sexes means it's harder to be a breadwinner. And so then in reaction to that, where I see the actual toxic maleness come is a reaction to a society that totally denigrates masculinity. And again, it's a lack of positive life scripts.
Yeah, it's a purpose question. I mean, and there's a chapter in the book by Michelle Shane, who's I think here, maybe. There she is, which is about kind of a loss of religious affiliation. And so it's not just a man's place in the family, like that they have a purpose as a father and a husband. It's not just a man's place in terms of a career path and making sure that they have a job that feels fulfilling to them. It's also a man's place in the whole community. And a religious affiliation, a religious community, even if you think certain religious groups are backward or whatever, I mean, there was a clear place for men and there was a clear place for them playing a role in leading that community and playing certain roles in religious ceremonies, in religious traditions, and that too gave them a sense of purpose. And as our country has become more and more secular, that script has been lost too.
Yeah, and correct. And just to add to that, first off, you really want to know what to do, really go to Richard Reeves' website. He has an Academy of Men and Boys, the American Academy of Men and Boys. I can tell you afterwards. I mean, I think he actually has action points, but just yet another dimension to all this is to the extent that young men and men are flailing to an extent, and they are in the workplace and in schools, and fewer go to college, and there's a litany of data on that, is that there are the mental health profession, and I'm the last person, believe me, I have a very kind of high threshold for turning everything into a psychiatric or mental problem, but it's such a feminized field, it's very hard to find a male therapist. Also, a lot of men do better in groups, and those kinds of settings are not as available as they should be. So, and that's something I think Richard's working on as well.
So one question I have from online is basically about, what would you hope would happen if you got to change anything, and that's realistic? Would this have to do with K through 12 schools doing things differently? Would this have to do with regulation of tech? I think Sally would say no to that. I don't know. What would you hope would change? Is a sort of a reasonable change in our culture among our institutions to make things better?
Go for it.
Well, I think leaving the regulation of tech aside, I'm certainly glad that we're getting the, bell-to-bells, phone bans in schools. And I think that represents a sign that we can change some of these things. I think it's going to be very hard to reverse some of the family, community stuff that we've been talking about. And so in some ways, schools sort of represent one of the best chances for, and if we can roll back some of this pessimism, some of the apocalyptic messaging, some of the messaging about how, just the world is so dangerous, and and educate both parents and teachers about what the problems of sending these messages are to kids. I think that, that could have, make reasonable improvements in the situation.
I agree, that's what I was gonna pick. The family would be ideal, of course, but that's even harder to change. And one of the advantages of schools is that, as overrun as they are with this kind of ideology, they still have their own kids. And so they can identify with this problem, which is different from any other problem I work on, because most people don't need kidneys, which is another one. But here, everybody has a kid, and that really brings it home.
Yes. Mike, right behind you. And then we'll move up to the question in front.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you, Naomi. This is our collective future, right? I'm Andrew Sachs, Nobel Learning. Kids trade live learning and leadership instead of likes, sort of take back your kids from TikTok. One of the things that my kids said to me, we're in about 170 countries, so we're seeing this all over the globe. This is not restricted to the United States. One of our kids said, what's wrong with you old people? You force us to learn all this stuff that doesn't matter. You take our time, you take our youth, and then you put a device with apps more addictive than any drug known to man in our pocket. How much of this is us creating a media and social media ecosystem that creates a feedback loop on humanity that was never there before? And is that the best tool to go and fix this?
Yeah, I'm going to follow up with that because I do think part of the discussion is the flow to social media. The people who say that social media doesn't cause mental health problems with kids say that the kids with mental health problems are just more likely to spend more time there. I believe that some of that is true, but I think that what you're pointing at is that the medium is the message, and what's taught to kids by, I think, probably all the social media apps is like a bad anthropology, is a miswritten notion of the self, right? Like there's something philosophically wrong that comes through on social media. And I think those themes go through all the chapters in this book.
Yeah, I mean, there's so you don't even have to think about it in these kind of diagnostic terms. I mean, the first thing that should strike everybody about the phone is the self-absorption. I mean, forget about the feedback loop and everything else. Like, just think about the camera and the selfies and to me, like, if you cannot as a kid be taught about all the other people around you and it's just you and this device, like that in and of itself is the beginning of the problem. And so, you could get into all the terrible effects of the algorithms and everything else, but I don't even think you need to go that far in order to understand the denigration of mental health that's happening as a result of these phones. So I guess I would start there. I don't think we're going to be able to put this toothpaste back in the tube anytime soon, and I'm not sure how we would legislate that effectively. I think, honestly, the best thing we could probably have done were these school bans, because I think that has created the beginnings of an alliance of adults. So it's created that finally, I've always thought like teachers would be on the same page as parents on this. But I think each side was sort of, for a while, kind of pointing to the other and saying, they're preventing us from doing this. No, they're preventing us from doing this. So maybe this is kind of the beginnings of a larger cultural shift on the issue. That's all I could hope for.
And making it easier for the parent who wants to say no, but is afraid all the other parents are going to say yes.
Yes.
Also, the bans, at least the early data, show, I think, pretty consistently that kids' academic performance is improving, and the more kids' academic performance improves, I think that would have effects on mood, as well, because you feel more competent. You can kind of envision a future. Hey, I'm pretty good at math. Maybe I could be an engineer or whatever. And the other thing to remember about these phones is social media. It's not just the social media, what that could be doing, and I don't deny what it's doing probably to some girls who are completely enmeshed in it. I mean, they're really quite, talk about rabbit holes, but websites that are really unhealthy about eating disorders, promoting them and this and that, and self-harm. I mean, gruesome things. But apart from that, even if they're just doing pretty mundane stuff, it's what they're not doing. So you're not sleeping if you're all, obsessed with your phone all night, and that is huge. I mean, sleep just as a physiological variable is really very important for teens' development. And you're not socializing with other kids, and you're not, God forbid, reading books. So it's also what you're missing out as a result of your engagement.
I think in the book you call it the opportunity cost. And this is the way that I feel about video games. I don't think violent video games cause kids to be violent, but we kind of accidentally didn't give our kids video games. And I'm so happy. I remember this one time running on this beautiful Saturday in July that wasn't 110 degrees, ran into this other guy when we were both going to do TV hits. I used to go on TV, like at MSNBC. and he sees me with like my 5 kids in the green room, and he said, "Oh, I wanted to bring my kids out today too because it's such a nice day, but Saturdays are video game day, and I couldn't do anything to tear them away from that." And I just thought, well, that's really a shame there. So yeah, the opportunity cost of the apps is another thing to lament. Yes, question.
Hi, the thing I've always heard, I don't think it's a very common thing for kids to be schizophrenic. I've never heard it was marijuana. I heard it was actually older men siring children, and that is also supposed to be a big factor for autism. Now, I don't know if this ADHD is considered autism, but it says here on the CDC, national estimates among U.S. children aged 3 to 17 years who have been diagnosed with ADHD varies from 6 to 16%. Estimates for receiving any ADHD treatment among children, is 58 to 92%, and that's Ritalin, which is a toxic drug. And also these psychotropic drugs that they put kids on, and it's usually teenage boys. And before these, now it's currently transgenders who are really girls doing it, but all these mass shootings used to be done by people like the Batman guy.
Yeah, right now we got about 8 things on the table, so I'm gonna try to get Sally on any of these.
Yeah, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's somewhat it's a legitimate diagnosis. Kids have it for sure, but it is also overdiagnosed. It is different from autism. It is different from autism spectrum, and it's unfortunate that we don't have enough family therapy, because that's probably the first therapeutic step you would take. We spend too much time with the kid as the patient. Really, the family is the patient.
Yeah, there's a chapter in the book by Lauren Stiller called The Tyranny of Happiness, which gets into some of the problems that we're seeing in therapy itself. And one of Sally just pointed to the fact that we're not involving parents more in the therapy. It's just parents drop off their kid, expect that to solve the problem, as if the kid is sort of living in their own world without any other people that they're interacting with.
And that isolated, atomized, and again, I was talking about anthropology, the idea of the child as just a free-floating individual rather than a member of the family. That is a common theme throughout the therapy, the internet, even the hyperachievingness. You see these kids who are like, wow, that's really impressive how much work he put in to get his personal record in the swimming race. And then you realize, okay, family dinner's out the window. They have to eat this specialized diet. They're swimming, 7 days a week. And you realize that isolated, atomized view of the individual, disconnected from their role in the family, that's really a common thread through a lot of the problems.
Can I mention another thing that Dr. Diller, he unfortunately can't be here, makes in terms of psychiatry? It's a real paradox in my field, because there aren't enough child mental health specialists, and unfortunately too many of them really aren't of the quality that we would like. And he talks, one of his prescriptions is for Medicaid and Medicare to not cover child neuropsychiatric evaluations. Of course, there will be exceptions. There are kids who really do need it, but the threshold for also for medicating kids, some need it, some don't. But to send them to these incredibly expensive hour-long neuropsych evals are often just a complete waste of time. And also, if I just tell a tiny little story here, a colleague of mine, her son just seemed like lost. I think he was around 15, a little disinterested in things, maybe what we'd call dysphoric, not radically depressed. And so she took him to a therapist, and this therapist managed to elicit that from the son, that he was suicidal, and that he should not only get a what's called a SPECT scan, SPE. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's a brain scan of sorts, and they're notoriously unhelpful in making diagnoses. And once you start bringing in technology, it gets expensive, and so I asked her some questions about her son. He wasn't suicidal. Some kids use that in a metaphoric way. I'm unhappy and I wish I weren't. I wish things were different, but in what way? And not in the way of, I don't want to exist anymore. He just was dissatisfied and lost. And we came up with a plan about, what he really wanted to do, which had to do with actually fashion. And he's doing great. And he didn't get a stupid scan, and he didn't get the testing. But how many parents have someone they can call because these therapists are, they appear to have authority, and they're
Well, and the schools are
referring to
encouraging the tests
So
too. So
yeah,
that creates, and it uses up a lot of time that
Yeah,
good
that could be
therapists could be spent
on the really
actually
mentally ill
yeah.
kids too.
All right, yes, another question up here.
Just on the school portion, ADHD overdiagnosis a lot of times is teacher driven, and we can see this in the data based on age groups. The youngest kids in every grade seem to be diagnosed at a higher rate. One statistic that you mentioned, Sally, that really stood out to me was that 20% of parents don't expect their children to get married. Robert Pondisio, in his book, How the Other Half Learns, talks about what he calls the gas factor, the give a shit factor. And this seems like something that might be affecting both high income and low income families, and it has to do with this script. If we are not giving this script of what we know makes for successful, meaningful lives, to parent households, is that something that we really do need to be more explicit about in the scripting? And how far can we think about this from a policy perspective?
Yeah, do you want to ask? Kay, do you want to have thoughts? Here, you can take the microphone.
I think the script is really key to children's having a view of the future. And by the way, when I talk about a script, this is a cultural norm that many people don't accept anymore. And you can look at any culture in history or across the world, they all have scripts for what happens when you, for instance, hit puberty. What happens when you become educated in a certain skill. We don't have any of that. We just say, make up your own script, figure out what it is, who you are. It starts as like do it yourself. And I think, I've been making this point for decades now, that what we know from a lot of research is that it's not just that the family life is good for individual kids, it's good for the society. And when you have as many kids as we do who are not growing up in stable two-parent homes, it's not just that they begin to imagine a different or begin to think it doesn't really matter. I hear that all the time, whether you have that. But that they can figure out something else that'll be just as good, and nobody can tell them what to do. And I mean, there's another issue here about the script that it's tangential but very related, and that is this individualism, the autonomy that we teach children so at a very, very young age. You will make your own life. And to a certain extent, that's what we're about, right? We are an individualistic society, and it's an arrangement that has given us enormous riches and great inventors and entrepreneurs and all of that. But there has to be also some sense that family life is there to perpetuate the culture, to perpetuate the society. And every human group has devoted itself to ensuring that happens. And we're not doing that because we're saying, oh, you don't, it doesn't matter whether you have kids. I have a lot of friends who are now grandparents. And if I ask them, well, is your daughter, one friend I'm thinking of in particular, she has one child. I said, is she going to have another child? She said, oh, I don't know. I could never ask that. And I understand what she's saying. You don't want to feel like you're pressuring your kid to go according to your own ideas about this. On the other hand, we know something, adults, about what works and what makes them happy. And now, and this is a woman who is so in love with her grandchildren, it doesn't make any sense that she can't pass this on. But I hear this all the time. No, don't pressure your kids. Don't tell your kids because they're their own people.
I'm wondering if, Michelle, if you had anything to add, because this sort of seems related to kind of what religious communities also, they're providing, obviously, a kind of sense of purpose and also kind of maybe that intergenerational experience where maybe somebody else in the community will pressure you to have grandchildren.
Yes, so we're using this word script a lot, and I kind of want to dig under that word because I think when we're saying script, what we mean is purpose. I think what we mean is that kids need a sense that they matter, that they have significance in the universe, and that the choices that they make are part of a larger whole. And that's something that religion does provide, and that's something that as fewer and fewer families are raising their kids in religious communities and with religious commitments, fewer and fewer kids also have that sense of purpose. And so the question then becomes, well, all right, what fills that hole? What fills that God-shaped hole in their lives? And I don't think that we've been successful as a society in finding alternative structures of meaning that can fill that sort of deep inherent need.
And my own theory on this is that the racial pessimism, racial guilt of the last few years, where if you asked high school kids today compared to when we were in high school, you would think that race relations in the U.S. had gotten much worse, that the discrimination against minorities had gotten much worse. But that pessimism, the climate alarmism, is an attempt to fill that need. There's got to be something bigger than just me. I know that that I was not made perfect, and that it's a pursuit to fill that. Well, yeah.
Oh, no, gosh, please.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Question here.
Hello. I haven't had the chance to read the book yet, but if I were to ask you, that as a community college professor, that if I go back come August and I teach a course in human development across the lifespan or child development, what are some things that you would want the students of today to learn about? Like, to bring some change such that mental health doesn't continue to be such a critical concern all the time. What is something that, as far as education and knowledge, that you want to be imparted in the students of today?
Thank you. I like that question. I'm not saying they do, but.
No, I mean, I think that there are sort of two questions. I mean, for the young adults you're talking about, I mean, one question is sort of what to do about their own mental health, and the other one is sort of what to do about, future generations. And I think probably this book is sort of geared more to the question of how you can, if you're starting from scratch, if you're trying to influence younger children, how can you improve their mental health outcomes? In terms of what young adults sort of today can do, I think probably there are, a limited number of options. I mean, it's hard to sort of say like, we should give them a script now at the age of 22 or whatever. I mean, I presume you're teaching, kids up to who are not kids anymore. So I think that's a problem. Probably then the solutions become more along the lines of getting off screens and social media and things like that, and sort of getting out more into the real world and trying to find their purpose there, as opposed to sort of, looking inward.
I mean, you're already presumably working with a population that is that already has a sense of their future. I mean, they are in school. So there's not something I admit I've given much thought to beyond, age 18 and the classic development years. But what kind of teacher are you? What's your topic?
I teach psychology.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe child development. What's a healthy child development? Because they're going to be having kids. And also, whenever you learn about what a healthy trajectory was. I mean, this is normal. You would think back on, well, what was mine? And maybe, gee, my parents did this, and they tried, they were wonderful, but I could do this differently. Anyway, that's kind of my 2 cents, is to not focus, but make sure they really understand what goes into raising,
Yeah, they could smoke less pot too. That's a quick fix.
Anyway, raising their own kids. I mean, obviously not explicitly, but just integrated into what you do, and I'm sure you do teach that.
Well, the classic textbooks teach this, teach that, and there's all these concepts and theories, Erickson, and I don't want to go into all the theories, keeping our audience in mind.
Yeah.
But what is something different that's not in my textbook that I will discover from here?
Well, I would read Richard Reeves' book, actually, because I don't know how many men you have in your class. Is it predominantly young women?
It's mostly females, but intro classes.
Well, they could benefit by knowing about men's experience. I mean, that's just one
Well,
thought.
and this gets to one of my questions, which is, again, one of the missions of modernity is erasing differences, especially between men and women. And there's, we touch on gender ideology and that you create your own gender identity, but also just in general, there are differences between boys and girls. And how much does that, do those differences show up here? Suicide rates changing, or attempts, ideation you mentioned. What else is sort of gendered in this book that people should know about?
That's a great lead-in.
Yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Oh, there's a wonderful chapter by Zach Goldberg, who's a data scientist. It's a really brilliant guy. It's probably, I would think it's maybe the chapter that would be the most novel to most people reading it. And, I wish I had I just want to tell you the title. Wish I had the book. It's called Who Does Hyperbolic News Hurt Most? This should be very interesting for you. I mean, everyone, but especially relevant, because he's talking about, as a topic frankly, to teach about, he's talking about the kind of innate personality traits that come with girl being a young female, and that the two that are particularly pronounced in young women and girls are what he calls justice sensitivity. He uses that I think the 5 classic traits: openness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, agreeableness, and extroversion. And somehow he takes out extroversion. I shouldn't explain why, I don't think, but and substitutes justice sensitivity. And he said that is so much higher in girls than boys, so that when they read about these horrible things, true or not, exaggerated or not, they take it, they internalize it, they get much more depressed, and that's the neuroticism part of it, meaning they get much more depressed, or actually they're more reactive to this kind of news. And so that all this doom scrolling has a disproportionate effect on girls, and it's a really data heavy chapter. It's really good.
Yeah.
We got a mic coming in.
I would think one important thing I want to be telling kids that age is the differences between the sexes, because there's been such a strong effort to really erase that and imply that there's just this monosexual psyche, and it's just not true. And it's one of the things, one of the reasons I think we're having so much trouble with people finding mates, because they don't know anything about the opposite sex, really. They just assume that, I think girls in particular think, oh, they should just be like me, and they're not prepared for the differences. So that would be something that I would think. There's plenty of research, start with that.
There's a trend, and it might all be just people, everything on social media is people doing things for clicks, but I have noticed a couple different things where a woman is saying, like, this is crazy, like, I just got into a wrestling match like with my fiance, and he's out of shape, and I work out 5 days a week, and he was about 10 times stronger than me. And this was shocking to this 28-year-old woman. And I was like, A, this shows that we're civilized, that men aren't, attacking women on the average. But B, it shows that we're idiotic. We somehow believe, again, the gender equality story ran off the rails. I think we have time for one more question if we've got one back corner over there.
Yeah, I want to ask about something that hasn't been hit on. With the digital environments you mentioned at the beginning, exposure to pornography for young boys and men. I wonder if you could just touch a little bit on that. Parents aren't having an opportunity to have conversations about this because the age that boys are experiencing and being exposed to this is much younger, whether it be at school or on the bus. So what role does that commodification of desire play in the rates that we're seeing in symptoms of depression and anxiety among young men?
Well, I think it's really how does that affect young women? Because they have such unrealistic expectations about what romance, or even just sexual encounters, should be like. So I think that's one element of it. Would you like to?
Yeah, and I would say it's sort of creating this chicken and egg situation where the expectations are unrealistic, and so as Kay said, sort of this, this affects the actual ability to, find a partner and mate, which also contributes to, the mental health issues, that you can't form these healthy relationships with members of the opposite sex, and that too is making you, more anxious and depressed. So we do two of the chapters. I think.
Paul Weigel says, the effect creates a vicious cycle. The more pornography they consume, the less exciting real-world romance seems, and the less they pursue it, the more daunting it seems, leading to greater reliance on pornography.
Yeah, what he said.
Right. I think women have more trouble finding men and may get more resentful. And I don't mean to make a cartoon out of this, but it almost sounds like a little going on the road to, that the phenomenon of incelhood, where guys feel so estranged from women and so puzzled as to how to approach them, and so rejection sensitive when they often get rejected.
And I was thinking about this also.
Mean they're going to get violent, but I mean it's just a despairing way to live.
In terms of the having one child phenomenon, you're also now less likely to grow up with a member of the opposite sex in your home, and so less likely to be exposed to, say, the fact that boys smell differently, or teenage boys might act a little different than teenage girls. So anyway.
And
creating more problems.
Our AI colleague Christine Emba wrote a book, I think 2 years ago, called Rethinking Sex, and a lot of it is just about the perverse expectations and how that just destroys the millennial and Gen Z dating world. Again, I recommend reading the essays in this book. Take a copy home. Take a copy home to give to the parents in your life. And join me in thanking Naomi and Sally.
Thank you.